My friends, we know that it's towards the end of the liturgical year because always, as we get at that end of the liturgical year, the last couple of Sundays, we have these readings that talk about the end of the world. Mark's gospel filled now with tribulation. The sun is darkened, the moon doesn't give its light. Stars fall from the sky. Powers of heaven are shaken. These are the last days, the end of the world, the final judgment. The last chapters of the Gospels always have these stories, and the book of Revelations and the prophets we've read. Some people like all this. I don't particularly care for all of this end of the world sort of things. From the earliest centuries, there's always been people who focused on that. Even in our own days, maybe you can remember, was several years ago, there was some gentleman who said the end of the world was coming, so please come with me. He went out to a camp. Give all your money to me. We'll be ready for the end of the days. Someone told me that they were driving on the freeway, and there was a car in front of them that was sort of weaving a little bit and slowing down, then speeding up. So he drove a little bit closer, and it had a very large bumper sticker. And it said, "Don't get too close to this car, because at the time of the rapture, the driver will be taken up to heaven." So watch out for those who are looking forward to the end of the world if they're driving. I mentioned at the start of the Mass that today Pope Francis has said we should particularly focus on the question of the poor around the world. He calls it the World Day of the Poor. It's not just the 33rd Sunday of the year, and next Sunday we'll be celebrating the end of the year with the Feast of Christ the King, but this should be a special focus on a special topic, the World Day of Poor. Now, I went to Google, as I always do, and I found dozens, indeed hundreds, of World Days. It seems to be a popular thing. You declare a World Day. World Day of the Poor, but also we have coming up in the first Sunday of the year, the World Day of Peace, World Day of Prayer, of Social Justice, the World Day of Health, World Day of Kindness, Earth, Food, Cleanup, Wildlife, Intellectual Property. Then there's some unusuals, the World Day of the Mason Jar, the World Day of French Toast, the World Day for Cultural Diversity, for Dialogue and Development. There's no World Day of Tobacco and no World Day of War. Well, let me go back to this World Day of Poor. Why does Pope Francis write a special letter for that? He has a beautiful line introducing his talk. Or his writing. It's about 3 or 4 pages. You can go to the internet and get it. But he begins with a beautiful psalm, a quotation, the 6th verse of Psalm 34. "The poor cried, and the Lord heard them." The poor cried, and the Lord heard them. That's a challenge for me, and I'm sure it's a challenge for you too. Do I hear the cry of the poor? Do I respond? Do I respond? Well, it's a challenge for me personally. I moved out of Tacoma, where I really didn't have much contact. I lived here in this parish, much contact with the poor. I lived in the south side of Chicago for several years. Had a contact there. Inner city of Washington, D.C. for 17 years. Certainly contact there. And then my several decades in Africa. I'm not poor myself, but I saw the poor, and I was challenged when I read this statement of the Pope. The Lord hears the cry of the poor and responds. Well, do I? I'm prompted to ask, do I listen to the poor around me? The poor right here in the Northwest? Do I hear them? And do I respond? And perhaps you has those same questions yourself. This is very central to our faith. Well, I can think of 4 groups of poor women and men who've confronted me and obliged me to ask, do I hear their cry? And do I respond to them? There are elderly people, older people, that I've met who live in a kind of fear of the lack of decent medical care as they face rising costs and threatened cuts in government programs. I recall my recent experience a couple of years ago. I had open heart surgery, and I had excellent rehabilitation service for a month. It was just very, very good at the Lutheran Hospital there. And a good insurance program handled everything. I had no worries. But I noticed every so often some people, older people there, who would walk by me and sometimes they chat, who were very worried. They were worried because they didn't have that kind of good insurance, or they were worried that government programs were going to be cut back. And would they be able to continue to have good medical care? There's a lot of people around us that are in the midst of that, and they're wondering, would current White House desires to cut back on the medical programs, what would that mean? Would the public, would us, hear the cry of the poor, elderly, and respond with necessary political action or whatever? Then, of course, there are growing numbers of homeless around us, the poor around us. The street corner beggars right next to Bellarmine, where I live. The empty lot campers. Women, men, and children who can't afford the high rising cost of housing associated with the rising incomes of persons who are attracted to the booming Pacific Northwest economy. Here in Tacoma, I've met veterans enduring consequences of post-traumatic stress disorder, youth who are hooked on drugs, women who are abandoned with their children after a marriage breakdown, older men who are confused after losing family contacts. Can institutions like Nativity House or the programs here at St. Pat's really meet the needs of the poor, the homeless? Would good responses of the church agencies like St. Vincent de Paul, would they be enough? Would there be political action of concerned citizens sufficient to hear the cry of the rising poor population? Well, what about people of color who are disproportionately poor in this beautiful country, the United States, this beautiful part of this country, the Pacific Northwest? Hispanics, African Americans, brown and black. I thought of that challenge a few days ago because the Catholic bishops, who were having a meeting, very controversial meeting, but they released a pastoral letter they'd been working on that we'll have a lot of discussion on surely in the months ahead. It's a letter on racism in our country and the growing fact of that. It's called Open Wide Your Hearts, the Enduring Call to Love, a pastoral letter against racism. My 3 decades in Africa may have made me a little more sensitive to this issue, but there is racism, you know as well as I do. And it's prompted me to ask, do I hear the cry of the poor, as Jesus does, as God does, and do I respond? And then there are increasing numbers, of the poor who are locked up as detainees. They haven't committed any crime, they just don't have papers. They're in huge facilities here in the Northwest and in different parts of the country. Men who've worked in the local fields of vegetables and fruits for 35 years. Mothers who've recently lost their children, separated from their children at the border. Young women and men in the midst of college education, sent back to a country they had never experienced. People who are detained not because of crimes, but because they lose documents. In the past year and a half, I've met these poor. I serve as the Catholic chaplain at the ICE Detention Center on the Tide Flats. And I ask, well, what would it take to hear the cry of the poor and respond with hospitality? The hospitality that my ancestors as immigrants received in this country. You and your relatives possibly too. So, the psalm that the Pope uses in that letter, the poor cried, and the Lord heard them. Pope Francis asks us to pray on this World Day of the Poor, 2018, that we hear the cry of the poor and ask ourselves, how can we respond? Maybe simple ways, maybe more complex ways. Ways of charity, ways of politics. There is an issue you know better than I do. Do we respond? So let's just take a couple of minutes of a moment or so of quiet prayer and just ask ourselves, which poor do I hear and how do I respond? Not just with charity, but with maybe politics. How do I hear the cry of the poor?